Well, it's morning here in Gilda, and I'd like to share a story. I have the walking stick given to me by an old storyteller with a claw of remembering so that I can remember the stories to tell people. In the big pot cauldron of storytelling, of course, they all come from long, long ago. And this one does too, from Ireland. On the very edge of the island, on the farthest western edge, there was a hilltop, and one side went right down to the sea, and one side went right down the green fertile valley to the village. Well, there was a little stone cottage with a thatched roof on the very top of that hill with a family, a mother and a father and a daughter. Now they had everything they could possibly need to come from the sea and from their own garden and livestock. They had everything you could ask for, except for one thing. Their daughter didn't have a voice. Now some parents might think that's a really good thing, but these parents were a little concerned about her, and they took her down the valley to the village doctor, and he checked her head to toe, and there was nothing wrong with her, just no voice. And they took her far out into the woods to the old woman healer, and she checked her head to toe, and there was nothing wrong with her, just no voice. Now you see, when she was born, she was the most beautiful baby anyone around had ever seen. She had skin the color of the swan's wing and hair the color of the raven's wing. In fact, they named her Brada, which is the Irish female word for raven. Such a good baby. She never cried, but she also never laughed. And as a toddler, she never said her first words like mama or daddy. And the parents were worried, and they really, really would say they love her every night and wish that she could say it back. Well, one day, Father went down to the village with some eggs to sell at market, and on his way home, as often happens in Ireland, the clouds became so heavy with rain and mist and melancholy that they just laid down on the ground. He couldn't see this far in front of him, so he kept his head right straight down to the path, making sure he didn't stray away. And it's because he was looking straight down he didn't see her, until he almost fell over her, an old, old woman. She was so old that her clothing was the same color as the muddy ground she was sitting on, and the old woolen shawl over her head, well, there was no way it was containing that wild, crazy gray hair. And her face, he felt like if he could get a hold of the two cheeks and pull them apart, well, there might have been enough face for two. She wasn't scary, but she did startle him mightily, and he said, "Old woman, what brings you out on such a miserable day as this?" And she reached a bony finger up, motioned to him to bend down. Well, he did. He leaned over close so that he could hear what she had to say. And in a very gnarly, well-used whisper, she said, "You need only to ask the good people for what you seek." Just as she said that, all of the rain that had collected on his hat brim dripped right into his face, and he raised his hands to wipe it away. And when he took his hands down, she was gone. Well, he knew exactly what she meant. You see, in Ireland they often call fairies the good people. They will play tricks on you, and they can be mean if you disrupt their homes or their lives. But if you're good to them and leave them treats and be kind to them, they can often help you. So head down to the path, he scurried on up the hill home. He told Brana and her mother all about the old woman, and they were so excited. Brana's mother made the most beautiful round wheel of soda bread, and she wrapped it in a linen cloth. And she took the very best cream off the top of the milk pail, put it in a little cup, and she put those two things out in front of the cottage, and they went to bed. Well, it was hard going to fall asleep because they were so excited about what might happen the next day. And wouldn't you know, in the middle of the night, the darkest hour, a huge storm raged in off the Atlantic. It blew so hard they thought the thatch would come right off the house, and they could feel the surf pounding the land beneath them at the bottom of the hill. Oh, it was a frightful night. But as often happens the next day after a storm, the sun came up and it was bright and beautiful and clear. Well, they stepped outside, and there was the linen cloth with only crumbs, and there was the cup with no cream. Oh, they were so excited. They checked all around the farmyard. They looked in the garden shed and in the barn and all around the garden, but they didn't find Brana's voice. Well, Father said, it's time to go to the seashore with our baskets. Now, people who live by the sea know that when there's a huge storm, that the sea itself rips up the seaweed, the kelp from the bottom of the seabed, and pushes it up onto the seashore. And people who live by the sea know that that kelp is the very best fertilizer for your garden. So you'll often see people collecting it after a storm. So they took their baskets, and down the hill to the seashore they went. Oh, they filled their baskets so fast. There was far more kelp than they could possibly use. But there were also treasures, beautiful colored sea glass, all smooth, and tumbled driftwood, smooth and gray. And there was bits of fishing line, and there was even a brass plate from a pirate's sea chest. All the treasures they found, but they didn't find Brana's voice. Just as they were ready to head back up the hill towards the cottage, they heard a sound far, far, far down the beach. It was the most unusual sound they had ever heard. It wasn't human. And Father said, there's plenty of daylight left. Let's go down and see what's making that sound. So they walked and they walked and they walked. And the farther they walked, the higher the cliffs went beside them. And they came to a point where they had to go between the cliff and the sea. And when they rounded that little cliff edge, there was a cove, a beautiful inlet, all protected. And right there on the sand was an enormous whale skeleton, all silver and smooth and tumbled in the sea, and obviously pushed up there from the storm the night before. And the great ribs were like fingers sticking up out of the sand. And the sound they were hearing, that was the wind blowing through those ribs. Brana thought it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. She rushed immediately to one of the giant ribs, wrapped her arms around it, and closed her eyes and listened and listened. Well, some time went by, and Father said, we need to get going. The tide is rising and the sun is setting, and we need to be home before dark. So back along the cliff edge and the beach they walked. They collected their baskets and all their treasures, and back up to the cottage they went. Well, that night, it was hard not to smile falling asleep. They hadn't found Brana's voice, but it was such a glorious day, so magical. And sound asleep they fell. Until in the darkest part of the night, there came a poking at Father. When he opened his eyes, who did he see but the old woman who raised her bony finger to follow her? So he got up and he followed her out, and she took him into the garden shed. And when he lit the candle to see what was going on, there were 3 good folk and the old woman sitting on his workbench. Well, they began to whisper in his ear, giving him instructions and directions and what to do. First they said, take the beautiful gray, silver, smooth piece of driftwood that looks like this, and stick the straight one on like that. And then go to the ash bucket and pull some charcoal and rub it all over and make it dark. And then take that fishing line you found today and stretch it in the center bits like that. And the old brass plate from the pirate's sea trunk, cut a shape like this out and put it on the side of that driftwood. Well, it took him all night, and when the sun came up, of course, the good people and the old woman disappeared, as often happens magically, and he had no idea what this thing was that he had made. But he took it into the house and set it in the cottage floor. And the minute that Brana woke up, she saw that, and she knew exactly what it was. And she pulled the milking stool over close and pulled it back on her shoulder. And she began to pluck on that twine in the open space. She closed her eyes and she played and she played and she played. As time went on, she became very much in demand. She was called on to play for happy times like babies being born or weddings. She was called on to play for sad times when someone was sick or at a wake when someone passed away. But most of the time you'd hear her up on the hill up above the cottage with her eyes closed, just playing for the joy of the sounds she could make. So you see, they did find Brana's voice that day. There's so many voices in the world, and for Brana's voice it was the harp. And there are so many languages in the world. For Brana's language it was music. And we all know that music speaks truer than words.